Good afternoon to you, Sir Iain.
Morning, Julie.
Thanks for
Or
joining us.
afternoon, I beg your pardon.
It took me months to make that transition. Still not quite made it regularly. It's very interesting that the Prime Minister, whether it's Prime Minister's questions or with set-piece speeches now, his attacks seem to all now be focused on the leader of a party with just 5 MPs, as opposed to the leader of the official opposition, Kemi Badenoch. It does look like Keir Starmer regards the threat as being Nigel Farage, not Kemi Badenoch. Is he right about that?
Well, at this stage, my party is still languishing in the after effects of what was a complete mess we got into before the last election. It's only just less than a year since we had the election. So I think that position is the bit that we have to get out of. But on terms of Labour, we had a really bad local elections. We knew it was going to be bad. It was as bad as we could possibly have thought about it. All the stuff that came about, yeah. But Labour were the party that just made government with a 170 majority. You would expect Labour, under normal circumstances, to have advanced their position during those local elections because they were peculiarly high watermark for the Tories. Instead of which they actually lost councillors and lost council seats. And so the problem that Labour's got, which is now reflected in the polling, is that in actual fact their result was really about the split on the right of politics between Conservative and Reform, and many of those were in the seats that they have held historically, what we call the Red Wall. So yeah. Why is Starmer making a speech like this? Because his Red Wall MPs are running very scared now about the effects of reform in their constituencies. And so this is the problem that he faces. And so he's decided to try and turn his attention to reform. And there are elements of reform which certainly need questioning, but certainly that's the fear factor that runs through.
Well, it's interesting. The Prime Minister said that Nigel Farage has set out billions upon billions of completely unfunded spending and would blow up the economy all over again. He said precisely the sort of irresponsible splurge that sent your mortgage costs, your bills and the cost of living through the roof. It is Liz Truss all over again. Said his plans for the UK economy was a mad experiment. It's a bit rich from a party leader who is basically sort of pushing net zero policy, something that your party has been pushing for years as well, although Kemi Badenoch is now at least rolling back on that right now. But it's not possible for any party leader to make any claims about another party having sort of unrealistic spending and tax plans if they're supporting the trillion pound plus cost of net zero, which is totally unachievable, and those costs, that's a minimum cost to the economy.
Yeah, first of all, I've always been opposed to this statutory target for net zero. I thought it would lead, whenever you get into kind of religious ideology in politics, it always ends in tears. And this will end in tears. It's already ending in tears. We managed to get an amendment, by the way, on the Great British Energy Bill to stop the UK government importing goods made by slave labour from China. They were turning a blind eye to that. Can you imagine? Such is the religious zeal to get to net zero. They do not care, or they weren't caring, about the fact that China was using forced labour to make their arrays and sending them to the UK, and the UK was buying them because they were cheaper. That's how bad it gets when you get into this zeal. And so we managed to stop that finally. So that will actually cost them more now as a result of that. But we should just get rid of the ridiculous targets we've got on this. If we're going to get to net zero, the question really is we need to do it, if we're going to do it, in a way that doesn't damage people's lives, put costs up to them, and at the same time do away with our own energy resources. We have oil and gas. We are sitting on an island of oil and gas. America uses its shale gas and it's got its energy costs way down below ours, and as a result of that their economy has been growing. Ours is static because our cost of energy is the highest in the developed world, well, the highest in the world right now, and that is the base cost for everything we do with our lives. And what this government fails to understand is that you have to make a choice between whether people's costs need to be down or whether your zeal for this ideology is such that you must get there first. Less than half of 1% of all global emissions, if that's their concern, emanate from the UK. Nobody will notice anything that we do.
I'd like us to have more global emissions because we have manufacturing. I think that would be a good thing.
Well,
I'm not even saying that to be confident. I genuinely think the only reason we've got low emissions is because we've basically cracked up shop and shipped everything off to be done in India and China. You mentioned energy costs.
By the way, gas, oil, and coal.
Yeah, exactly. But you mentioned, of course, high energy costs, and this leads me on to another topic. AI, and we're going to be talking to an author of a book just talking about AI deep fakes and the threat that they pose. And there's no doubt at all. A lot of people saying the future is AI. It uses a huge amount of energy. No one in their right minds would set up an AI business in the UK, given our high energy costs. But an interesting announcement from the Defence Secretary to John Healey today, ahead of the Defence Strategy Review next week, talking about a sort of £1 billion fund to use sort of AI and an army of hackers here in the UK for the British military to protect us from cyber attacks, AI attacks by Russia, by China, by Islamist extremists, Iran, you name it. Philip Ingham, who's expert in this field, pointed out that already existed under a Tory government set up actually in 2020. But we should be spending money on that side of things, should we not?
Yeah, we have to. Well, let's just face it. We need to defend our country, and defence is tanks, aircraft, guns. It's also now cyber. The fact is that cyber is, in many cases, more effective in what's called the interim period between full-out war and peace, because you can get into people's systems and you can disrupt their daily lives. I mean, the reality is that if you are smart, and a huge amount of this comes from Russia and China, then if you get into the systems of the free market, then what you do is disrupt everybody's lives. You create chaos, as we've seen with Marks and Spencer's and co., such that they can't open their online services again for the moment. And all of that is caused by very simple viruses that are put into their system. So when you get into the more sophisticated areas where you can copy people using AI, you can make your sounds and your signatures look exactly the same as them, now you're in real trouble. And I have to tell you that I've been banging on about this for some time. But China has done something even more than that. They have brought together genomics with AI. They have the two biggest resources for that. BGI is the biggest.
Explain what genomics is.
Genomics is about your gene code. It's what they did was, of course, they very cleverly, BGI, sold the lion's share of most of the COVID tests that we used here. Chose China.
They gave us COVID and then bankrolled it.
And then also, by the way, they did all the pregnancy testing too. And again, we've been moaning about the fact that British government too easily allowed Chinese services in this respect. They were allowed legally to keep 15% of all of the gene codes that they picked up through those tests and take them back to China. Ooh. That is how stupid we have been. So now they're working on all of that in China, and what they are looking at is what are the propensities for disease and resistance in different ethnic groups. And therefore this will weaponize their ability next time to target this. And they're using AI to develop this faster. I've warned about this. I've written about it.
Absolutely. But again,
absolutely nothing.
But wait, this goes back. I mean, again, I feel the same way about us selling off most of London to the Middle East potentates as well. These people are not our friends. These are not our allies. We have been facing, cyber war and attacks from Russia and from China for many years, and real war in Europe, in Ukraine. China still the threat to Taiwan is still absolutely huge, and I find it extraordinary that we've been. Our politicians, allowing, let's have Huawei, let's allow any Chinese company, all Chinese companies being beholden, required by law to give any information the Chinese government wants and to act on their behalf as and when directed. I mean, that is literally a requirement. So there's no such thing as an independent Chinese-owned company to allow them to, let's go get involved in our 5G or get involved in building our nuclear power projects. There's been some concern, it's been seen in the States, of things like even selling us the solar panels. But so if we're going to become incredibly reliant on solar panels and wind turbines for our electricity in this country, they're still talking about 95% of our electricity reliant on renewables. I mean, again, insane. I think unachievable, but insane, especially when we saw those blackouts in Spain and Portugal recently, which was a bit of a giveaway, you'd think, and a wake-up call, but not to the ideologues and the religious zealots. But there is is actually a sort of a sleep switch, a cut-off switch, which is contained within that solar technology, which the Chinese manufacturers can just go click and then they stop working. We are in danger of literally giving up our ability to get anything done in this country to a hostile state. We know is a hostile state. Why do our politicians do that? Because I always think follow the money. I believe in incompetence more than conspiracy. But is it just that so many people are so beholden? China in particular throws money at universities, at government departments, everything, and that actually they just get beholden to the Chinese state in the same way that they bought up Africa and the Caribbean and South America. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that they're also stupid. The reality is...
Go for the obvious explanation.
I believe when the evidence is in front of you, as somebody once said, when the evidence changes, you change your mind.
Yeah.
And we haven't changed our mind when the evidence now is overwhelming. China has an objective, which is to undermine and destroy democracy and human rights. They don't believe in it. They think that this is an aberration of 200 years. Their form of government is the only form of government, and they want to become what I'd refer to as the Middle Kingdom. President Xi has said this, and by the Middle Kingdom I mean the center of everything.
Yeah.
And to do that, they have to overtake America, which they were on track to do until COVID, but they're still on track,
yeah.
Both economically and in terms of the military. Their military build-up now is staggering. Any one shipyard in China now builds more naval vessels in a year than the whole of the United States does. One. They are 130 times the capability of the US to build naval ships. These little facts that we keep dropping in to tell everybody, we are losing a war that we don't even know that we're fighting. And China knows very well, and they use every organ. And of course, the marketplace, they have destroyed the free market. They subsidize their companies,
yeah.
They use slave labor, they undermine the private sector elsewhere. The result is we've lost all our telecoms business. We've now got 3 Western companies that are just struggling to get done. Huawei and those other Chinese companies pretty much took over the world. And all of this has been happening in plain view. Instead, we've still got a government now that thinks going to China, each one of these ministers that trails
with a begging bowl,
looking pathetic. Here's a little piece of information. China has done no major FDI, foreign investment, direct investment, since 2017. Our lot think you can go over there and get them to put it in.
Well, the last lot went off. They came back with like £1 billion over 6 years. Like, really?
No, they didn't actually. Yeah, that was just it was actually HSBC that engineered that, and that was, I think, offsetting their paperclip costs for a period. It was tiny. It was risible. It wasn't an investment.
Can I just bring you just for fun? There's so much. There's another 20 topics I'd like to talk to you about, but I haven't got time. It's such an interesting conversation. By the way, Philip Ingram, who knows his potatoes on this, is nodding along to a lot of that. And you've been, as you say, banging that drum for a very long time, and I think 100% right about it. US tariffs. This US court basically saying, look, it's illegal. You've taken on executive powers in an emergency situation. There isn't an emergency situation. Having a trade deficit with the rest of the world isn't an emergency, quite obviously. But a lot of that, thinking of the tariffs on Chinese goods, again, you say subsidised Chinese goods, I think to a certain extent welcomed by some people, because actually, you have to have tariffs against a country that is, as you say, using slave labour and producing these items so much more cheaply because they've got state subsidies which we're not giving. It's not a fair playing field. What do you make of that tariff decision by the courts, and what do you make of the tariff war generally?
Well, I just come back from Washington last week, where I was there talking to Republicans and Congress and everything else, trying to figure out what they were up to. But what's interesting about all of this is the court, let's separate it for a second. The court judgment is about the misuse of what is executive power.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a couple of people in the States, and they already knew that what White House has done in many of the things that it's said is that presidential orders are in fact administrative. They're not meant to be policy. Mm-hmm. So they can't overtake law made by Congress, and they can't get rid of it. So what's happened here is a clash on the legal basis for what the president was announcing without Congress's approval.
Yeah.
That's the important feature. So, and the second bit is the strategy of it. The truth is right now is when he put the huge sanctions on this sort of game where they rose and rose and rose, something really interesting happened in the United States. For the first time ever, all those great blue chip companies who are full of very wealthy people, from Amazon to all the rest of it, it suddenly dawned on them as they were petrified as their shares were collapsing, that actually they're a double loser on this. Number one, why? Because those tariffs were likely to cut them off from their biggest markets, particularly China. But the second aspect of that is, not only were they losing their markets, but they suddenly realized they don't actually make anything in the USA anymore that's relevant to their exports. So their market and their production are all in the same damn country. It's called China.
Yep.
So suddenly they panicked and they were screaming at the White House. Why? Because they have been so ridiculous, just like we have. We have no control over our markets and over our production. That is how pathetic the West has been over the last 20 years. Bit by bit by bit, China owns us. And if we don't wake up to that right now, then there is no way on earth we'll even get to any military action, because we are bought and paid for. And the problem with that is we will buy all of their restrictions in due course, and they will run us. And that, I'm not just saying...
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think it's scaremongering at all.
That tariff showed just how weak the USA now is. The greatest economy in the world is in fact an economy based on Chinese exports and Chinese manufacture.
Absolutely.
That is where we are heading rapidly, if we haven't already reached there.
Just in case you're wondering, Sir Iain Duncan Smith is not allowed to travel to China. He's sanctioned by them, but I say proudly so. I've said, you've advised me that I probably can't go and do me planned visit to the Great Wall of China for safety, because let's face it, we've seen me journalists, Wall Street Journal being, held in captivity. Although I'd like to think any government that took me captive or hostage takers would probably give me back after a week. Just my thought, wouldn't they? Philip says they wouldn't last a week. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, so appreciate you joining us. I really appreciate the stuff that you talk about a lot of the time, and people say, oh, come on, it's off agenda. It's not. This is actually the real basis of a lot of the madness in Western policy.